A marble palace in Alexandria, columns crowned with gold. Priests whisper prayers in Greek and Egyptian, and at the center, a young girl, draped in linen, finer than silk, stands beside an aging king, her father. Her name is Arsino. She's 16, a princess, a living goddess. And tonight, she becomes her father's wife. How does a child become a bride to her own father? Why would a king destroy the boundary between blood and bed? This is Egypt under the Ptolemies, Greek rulers who claimed the legacy of Alexander the Great. They believed they were gods among mortals. To hold power over Egypt, they stole its symbols, crowns, temples, and even the sacred royal incest of the ancient pharaohs. But this union was more than tradition. Some whispered it was driven by obsession. Others claimed a prophecy demanded it, that Arsino carried the soul of her dead mother. Bernice, the only woman Ptolemy I ever truly loved. As the gold crown touches Arsino's hair, she tries not to tremble. Somewhere deep inside, she wonders if she is still herself, or just her mother's ghost. Reborn for her father's desire, they say some crowns are forged not with gold, but with silence, shadows, and secrets that cling to marble walls long after the queens are gone. Arsino's story begins on a day when the Nile rose higher than any priest had seen in decades. Some called it an omen of prosperity, others a warning. For Arsino, it meant only that her childhood was ending. She was 16 when her father summoned her to stand before the priests and nobles who packed the palace's great hall. Her hands trembled under linen embroidered so finely it scratched her skin raw. She had been prepared for this moment since she could walk, or so they told her. They taught her the words of ancient prayers, the tilt of her chin, the softness of her voice, when blessing statues and soldiers alike. But no tutor ever told her what it would feel like to be led by the hand toward a father who was no longer just her father. He was King Ptolemy, the first Soter, the great general of Alexander's army, turned ruler of a land older than any Greek city. In the years since he seized Egypt from Alexander's corpse, he had wrapped himself in symbols he barely understood. He carved his name next to pharaohs who had died 1,000 years before his own mother was born. He raised temples that glowed in the desert sun like fallen stars. He married Bernice, a queen whose beauty soothed the uneasy hearts of native Egyptians. They believed she was touched by the goddess Isis herself. Then Bernice died, leaving a single child behind, a child. With her eyes, her mouth, her voice, the kingdom whispered that the king never recovered. They said he would wander the moonlit courtyards, speaking to the statues they built for Bernice. Sometimes, servants swore they heard two voices in the shadows, his, and an echo that answered, Arsino? Was too young to understand any of that when her mother vanished behind a curtain of priests and funeral rites. They told her Bernice now lived among the stars. Later, they told her she had never really left. Every time she was dressed for a festival, every time they pinned golden serpents in her hair, they reminded her whose face she wore. It was an honor, they said. She was a living link between old Egypt and New Greece, a bridge between gods and men. But a bridge is only ever walked on, and bridges do not choose who crosses them. When the day came, Arsino thought she would faint under the weight of the gold crown they placed on her head. She did not look at her father. She stared instead at the floor, polished so perfectly she saw her mother's reflection staring back. Somewhere nearby, incense burned so thick it clung to her tongue when she tried to swallow her fear. Priests chanted that this marriage was sacred, that Isis had blessed it, that the bloodline must remain pure, as it had for the pharaohs before them. No one mentioned that Arsino was still learning to braid her hair without her nurse's help. No one asked what she dreamed about when she still dreamed at all. The court cheered. The people outside the palace threw petals on the marble steps. Some believed they were witnessing history. This was how dynasties survived storms that toppled lesser thrones. The Ptolemies would stand forever if they bound their veins to one another, knitting the living and the dead into a single, unbroken line. It was clever politics disguised as sacred tradition. But for Arsinoe, politics was a word that meant nothing when the doors closed and the incense faded. She understood only that her father's grief had found a vessel, and that vessel was her own flesh. Even before the crown touched her hair, rumors tangled through the palace halls. Some swore Ptolemy never truly saw Arsinoe. He saw Bernice. They said he could not bear to sleep alone in a bed where her ghost once lay. Others insisted the priests invented a prophecy, whispering that if the dead queen's bloodline ever mingled with foreign flesh, Egypt would fracture into dust and sand. So they made sure no foreign prince would ever touch Arsinoe. Her father would claim her instead. It sounded poetic in temple hymns sung for the masses. But behind heavy doors, the truth tasted like ashes in Arsinoe's mouth. On her wedding day, she felt every gaze like a chain wrapped tight around her throat. She learned how to smile while holding her breath. She learned how to stand still when her heart wanted to leap out of her chest and run. Each step toward her father felt like stepping deeper into a river she could not swim across. Once the vows were spoken, there would be no current strong enough to carry her back to who she had been. Somewhere in the hall, her half-brothers watched in silence. They were boys still, but old enough to know that their sister was now something more than sister and less than free. Some would grow to resent her, some would grow to fear her, and one day, one would try to take her crown for himself. But all that lay ahead in shadows Arsinoe could not see. That day, she could only see the gold that pressed into her scalp, the sweat that stung her eyes as she knelt at the king's feet. Later that night, when the songs faded and the guests stumbled away drunk on honeyed wine, Arsinoe sat alone in her chamber. Outside, the Nile lapped gently at the palace gardens. Inside, silence pressed against her eardrums so hard she thought it would crush her. She traced the carvings on the wall, a goddess nursing her son, a queen offering flowers to a falcon god. She wondered if any of them ever wanted to step down from the stone, walk into the water, and let the current carry them far from prayers and crowns. A servant entered once to stoke the oil lamps. The girl's eyes darted between Arsinoe's face and the crown that now lay heavy beside her. There was pity in her glance, pity and fear. She fled before Arsinoe could speak. In the empty room, Arsinoe whispered to the goddess Isis, because no one else would listen. She asked if her mother's spirit really lingered, if Bernice was watching from some secret place behind the stars. If so, did she see her daughter now? Did she see what love and legacy demanded of her only child? She stayed kneeling until her knees went numb. She prayed until her voice cracked, but the stone walls never answered. The incense burned low, the oil lamps flickered. Dawn would come soon enough, bringing a new day that looked exactly like the last, except now she was a daughter, a queen, and something else the priests dared to call divine. And though they crowned her as a goddess, they never asked if a goddess could still feel afraid. When morning finally came, the palace filled again with the footsteps of servants, advisors, guards with bronze swords, polished bright as the river. They called her Queen Arsinoe, Mother of Kings, Isis reborn. But behind every title she heard another name buried like a thorn under silk. Bernice, Bernice, Bernice. The living queen was now the ghost she carried inside her own bones, and so the girl who once dreamed of freedom woke to find herself draped in linen, finer than any dream could weave, yet more tightly bound than any chain a king could forge. After the crown settled on her head, Arsinoe learned quickly that a crown never sits lightly. There was no moment when she woke and felt only herself. Each morning began with the rituals drilled into her since childhood, the small dressed as honors, layers of heavy jewelry that cut into her collarbone, servants painting her eyes so that even her gaze looked otherworldly, scribes recording every gesture for the court poets to twist into something holy, and beyond the painted doors, the people of Egypt gazed up at her balconies, and told each other that the gods truly did walk among them again. But inside the palace, the real power did not rest with the girl draped in linen and gold. It slept inside the old man who clutched his throne, as if the granite might slip away from under him if he loosened his grip for even a moment. Ptolemy had built himself into a legend, while still alive Alexander's greatest general, founder of a dynasty that promised to outlive empires. But time made no promises to men who thought themselves divine. He aged badly, his mind sharp but his body soft and sour with disease that no prayer could wash away. Some nights he raged at the physicians, who circled him like flies. Other nights he summoned Arsinoe and simply stared at her face in silence, as if searching for a woman long gone behind eyes that no longer belonged to the dead. Power, for Ptolemy, was not a crown alone. It was the right to decide how history would remember him. He ordered statues carved to show him, young, immortal, a conqueror, forever, at Alexander's side. He had scrolls recopied to erase his mistakes, letters rewritten, so that betrayals turned into sacrifices for the greater glory of Egypt. But Arsinoe could not be rewritten. She was flesh, memory given breath. So he did what kings do when power feels fragile. He bound her tighter to him than any father should. If some at court pitied the girl, they did so in whispers behind thick curtains. Open your mouth too wide in Alexandria, and your tongue might be cut out by the next sunrise. Priests spoke publicly of tradition, how the divine rulers of old Egypt took sisters and daughters to wife, how the gods demanded blood remained pure, so the Nile would flood and the people would eat. But in private, even they wondered what devils prowled the king's dreams. Arsinoe's marriage was more than a ritual. It was a prison built of silken chants. She had no door to slip through, no lover to run to in the shadows. Her beauty was the only weapon she owned, but it was turned against her the moment it made her her mother's echo dot in the courtyards. Nobles brought gifts to honor her new title. Gold figurines of Isis, baskets overflowing with pomegranates and honey. They bent low, lips brushing the ground at her feet, yet their eyes darted quickly to the throne behind her, reading whether the old king's favor shifted with every nod she gave. Arsinoe learned to smile with her mouth, but never her eyes. She mastered the small language of survival, when to look down, when to stand silent, when to speak words that cost her nothing but sounded priceless to those desperate to keep their heads. The priests, who had once been her teachers, now bowed lower than any servant. They wrapped her image into new prayers, praising the union of living goddess and mortal king. They sang that through Arsinoe, the dead Queen Bernice breathed again, that Egypt's prosperity flowered from the marriage of grief and rebirth. The people outside the palace walls swallowed these hymns eagerly. Grain was plentiful, temples glittered with offerings. The river rose and fell, as it always had. What did it matter what bruises history left behind palace walls, if the bread was warm and the gods seemed pleased? But the truth was that the gods had little to do with the king's growing paranoia. Ptolemy knew too well what a fragile thing conquest really was. He had watched Alexander's generals turn on each other like dogs, kingdoms carved up with knives sharper than any blade on the battlefield. He saw sons kill fathers, brothers poison each other's cups. If his line broke, so too would the lie, that his blood was chosen by heaven. Arsinoe was his strongest wall too young to challenge him, too shaped by ritual to rebel outright. But a wall does not love its builder. It simply stands where it is built. There were nights when Arsinoe sat awake while the king slept. She listened to the soft hiss of the Nile beyond the window, the faint chant of guards patrolling corridors lit with torches that smoked like funeral pyres. She wondered what power truly felt like. Was it the ring on her finger so heavy with emeralds that her knuckles ached? Was it the weight of the crown that turned her hairline red? Or was it the quiet fear that crossed other people's faces when they realized she might one day speak with her own voice? In those moments, she discovered something the priests had never taught her. Power was not inherited. It was taken, piece by piece, while no one was watching. The king's advisors watched her more closely as his health withered. Some hoped she would bear another son who could secure the line. Others feared she might whisper poison into the king's ear, shifting favor toward those who bowed lowest. To them, Arsinoe was no longer just a vessel for the past. She was the future's most unpredictable blade, sharp, silent, and always at the king's side. A single word from her lips could raise a man or ruin him. Yet each favor she granted dug her prison deeper. Every alliance she stitched together with sweet words bound her to a network of men who wanted her as figurehead, not ruler. And so she learned to play her part better than any actress on the temple steps. She laughed at jokes that made her stomach turn. She poured wine for nobles who stared too long at the curve of her wrist, imagining whispers they would never dare speak aloud. She blessed festivals, opened ceremonies, touched the brows of peasants who fell to their knees, and called her divine. Each time she smiled, another rumor grew. Some said she was blessed by the goddess of magic, that she could twist minds with a glance. Others claimed she was cursed. No mortal woman could bear the weight of two queens inside her soul and remain untouched. Through it all, Ptolemy kept her close. When he raged at imagined traitors, Arsinoe was summoned to calm him with murmured reassurances. When he weakened so much that courtiers wondered if the old lion was ready to fall, it was Arsinoe who sat beside his bed, feeding him scraps of news from beyond the marble walls. Even then, he stared at her, not like a father, not even like a husband in the eyes of the law, but like a man desperate to keep the ghost of his lost love pinned to the earth. Through the heartbeat of a daughter who had no choice but to obey, years in that gilded cage taught Arsinoe to bury her own face behind her mother's smile. She learned that, in a world ruled by men who worship power yet fear the women who birth it, survival depends on becoming the story they want to hear until you are strong enough to tell your own. Each whispered rumor of rebellion was another thread she tucked away. Each false vow of loyalty was a stone added to the wall she would one day tear down, brick by brick. But for now, she endured, wearing her mother's ghost like a second skin, waiting for the moment when history would finally remember her as more than just the echo of another woman's name. When the priests wrote of queens, they liked to carve their names beside lotus flowers, ankhs, and falcons in flight. They preferred to remember them as perfect daughters of the gods, unchanged by doubt, unchanged by cruelty. But a woman does not stay marble forever. Arsinoe's transformation was not a single shattering moment, but a slow carving away of the girl she had once been. Her power grew quietly, in the hush between palace doors clicking shut and secrets traded like coins in the shadows. To the people, she was still the living Isis's wife and daughter, in one holy breath. To those who dared to look closer, she was no longer just her mother's echo. She was becoming her own legend, even if it poisoned her from the inside out. It began with whispers from the outer provinces. Ptolemy's sons by other wives grew restless under their father's declining strength and Arsinoe's rising presence. Some called her the favorite child, some spat that she was no child at all, but a snake coiled around the old man's heart. Half-brothers who once bowed at her feet now sharpened blades behind her back. They claimed she manipulated the king's every decision, that she kept him weak to tighten her own grip on the throne she could never openly claim. If they hated her, they also feared her. The same rumors that cursed her incestuous crown made. Her untouchable no common dagger could cut a goddess, they said, and no mortal army could unseat her, unless the Nile itself turned to dust in protest. Arsinoe knew every rumor by heart. She fed some herself. A rumor is more obedient than any soldier if handled well. She learned to drape herself in half-truths, a goddess when the people needed faith, a grieving daughter when courtiers doubted her loyalty, a cunning queen when spies dared to test her reach. But no mask can hide the cost forever. Each time she smiled to silence a rebellion, she felt the skin of her old self peel away, There was no more girl who dreamed of lotus ponds or ran barefoot through palace gardens. There was only a woman, bound to a father king, whose body rotted daily under the weight of an empire he refused to let slip from his grasp. He grew paranoid of poison. He made her taste his food first, sip his wine before he drank. Sometimes she wondered if he hoped she would fall dead at his feet, taking his terror with her. Other nights, when his mind drifted back to lost battles and broken treaties, he called her Bernice, not Arsino, and begged forgiveness for sins she never committed. In these moments, she saw the full horror of what her life had become. She was no longer only her father's queen or daughter. She was a vessel, carrying all the ghosts he could not bury. She wore her mother's face because he needed it. She spoke her mother's prayers because they soothed him. And inside, piece by piece, Arsino's own soul shriveled beneath the suffocating weight of borrowed memories. Yet power, once tasted, does not release its hold easily. She might have run if there had been a gate left open. But where could she flee? The priests owed her their titles. The nobles feared her favor. The people worshipped her as the breath that kept Egypt whole. She knew if she vanished, her father's sons would tear each other apart for the scraps she left behind. So she stayed and hardened herself against the dread that once kept her trembling through endless nights. She learned to watch the men who thought themselves her masters. She watched how they lied, how they bribed, how they murdered each other in secret chambers. And she learned to do the same, only better, only quieter, when Ptolemy's strength faded to the point that he could not stand without help. The palace was thick with the smell of illness and the taste of treachery. Servants hurried with cloths and scented oils, but no perfume could disguise the decay of a body kept alive only by sheer will. Arsinoe sat by his bed, as always, whispering reassurances she did not believe. In his fevered dreams, he clutched her wrist so tightly her skin bruised purple. He spoke of Alexander, of how the empire should have been his. He cursed generals long dead, sons not yet born, enemies real and imagined. He never once asked if his daughter was tired of being his last desperate anchor to the past. Outside that sick room, factions formed like cracks in marble. Ambitious nobles courted her half-brothers, promising gold armies. Alliances, if they would stand against a woman who turned grief into dominion. She knew every plot. Informants bent their knees to her and whispered secrets into her palm like offerings to a god. Some nights, she lay awake on her stone bed and pressed her fingers to her throat, wondering if she still had a voice of her own, or only the echoes of others, her father's paranoia, her mother's lost beauty, her people's blind devotion. It was during these nights she decided that if she must be a goddess, she would not be a silent one. She called in advisors and demanded reports on trade routes, temple tides, garrison strength. She ordered grain stockpiles moved to the cities that needed them most. She oversaw repairs of canals left crumbling under lesser men's neglect. To the people, this was proof she was divine favor, made flesh. To the priests, it was unsettling proof that the girl they'd raised to be a passive vessel now wielded power sharper than any blade. She did it all, while the king wasted in bed, blind to the empire reshaping itself in his name but under her hands. But the more she seized control, the more alone she became. Friends were tools, family was threat. Servants trembled to meet her eyes, fearful she might read their thoughts and decide they were one whisper away from betrayal. Even her prayers, once frantic pleas for freedom, now turned into cold bargains with the gods she no longer trusted. If she must live this lie, she vowed she would bend it until it broke. If she must be worshipped as Isis reborn, she would not be meek or forgiving. She would be storm and flood, crown and blade. The final unmaking came not from her father's death, but from what it revealed about who she had become. When Ptolemy finally slipped into the darkness he had feared so deeply, Arsinoe did not weep. She sat at his bedside, fingers brushing the cold hand that had held her captive in silk chains. There was no warmth left for her to cling to, only the chill of reality that the man who had devoured her childhood, shaped her youth, and fed his ghost on her flesh was Ganand, that without him, the throne was both hers and forever out of reach. Those who had once cowered before her now circled like vultures. Her half-brothers moved quickly to claim what they believed their blood alone entitled them to. The priests spun new hymns to distance the dynasty from its scandal. They recast Arsinoe in stone and song, immortalizing her beauty, her piety, her sacrifice, yet burying the truth of her suffering beneath gilded lies. She had kept the kingdom whole while her father's mind decayed, but now that he was gone, they would pretend her power had never existed. A goddess when needed, a shadow when convenient. In the halls she once ruled with her gaze alone, she walked now as both queen and ghost. She heard the new king's courtiers murmur about sending her far away, perhaps to a brother's court in Thrace, perhaps into a marriage that would bind her and silence her in equal measure. But deep within, Arsinoe felt something they had never seen in her, hunger sharper than grief, an anger that could not be drowned in ritual and marble hymns. She knew they would never give her freedom willingly. She would have to seize it, even if it meant becoming the very monster they feared. No longer daughter, no longer just a symbol of lost beauty and dead queens. Arsinoe felt the final scraps of the girl she had been burned away, leaving behind a woman forged by betrayal and bound by no one's name but her own. After the marble tomb closed over Ptolemy's body, the palace walls no longer whispered his name in fear, but in caution, as if speaking too loudly might summon the old king's ghost, to judge how poorly his sons filled the space he left behind. Arsinoe stood among them not as an honored queen, but as an obstacle, a breathing reminder of a reign built on a lie no one wished to repeat aloud. They called her sister, mother, widow, goddess, but what they meant was threat. Too much power lingered in the tilt of her head, the memory of how she had ruled while the king lay half alive. Too many knew she had learned to wield loyalty like a knife pressed beneath the table. So they did what careful men do when a woman's shadow grows too large. They conspired to erase her piece by piece, until nothing remained but her name etched on temple walls. No one truly read. First came the isolation. Doors that had once opened before she even touched them now stayed shut until summoned by men who once bowed to her voice. Letters from allies vanished before reaching her hands. Those who once swore fealty to her father turned their coats inside out, promising allegiance to whichever son claimed the title pharaoh quickest. She was offered new rooms in a distant wing of the palace, gilded but cold, closer to the courtyards than the throne. They told her it was for her comfort. She understood it as a cage, dressed in silk curtains and incense, but a cage all the same. Guards at her door smiled and called her divine mother, yet counted every step she took. When that failed to break her resolve, they turned to marriage. There were many who believed her womb still valuable, that tying her to a foreign ruler would turn her into a bridge rather than a banner for rebellion. She received offers cloaked in velvet words, princes who promised protection, generals who hinted at love she knew would never arrive. Each proposal was poison dipped in honey. She listened to them all, played the grieving widow when required, but her mind stayed fixed on the truth. Once wed, she would never be free again. She would become a vessel for another man's heirs, another dynasty's claim to her father's myth. So she refused them all, politely at first, then coldly. When soft words no longer shielded her, her half-brothers fumed in secret councils. They did not dare touch her outright, not yet. The people still called her blessed by the gods. The priests still led hymns, praising her name with her mother's. To harm her openly would unravel the fragile thread holding the dynasty together. So they made her smaller through rumor instead. They revived the old scandals, sharpened them until they sliced through the last scraps of sympathy she might claim. They whispered that she was cursed, unclean, unfit to bless crops or armies. Some claimed she bewitched her father into sin, others that she would poison any man foolish enough to lie in her bed. The same mouth that once kissed her hands now spat on her name. But rumor alone could not kill her spirit. They had underestimated how well she had learned from her father that fear, once born, feeds itself. With each attempt to silence her, Arsinoe found new ways to speak. She bribed servants to slip her messages through temple couriers. She left offerings at shrines where peasants gathered, knowing even one rumor of a hidden blessing could bind hearts tighter than gold. She reminded generals who owed their ranks to her father that betrayal cut both ways. And so, the sons who thought they held her in gilded chains woke each dawn to find fresh whispers of revolt waiting at their gates. Minor revolts, scattered, but enough to force them to waste soldiers and coin. Enough to remind them that their sister was not as docile as they hoped. But defiance carries a cost. No crown can pay forever. Word reached her that allies beyond Egypt's borders no longer trusted her power to hold. Foreign kings measured her worth not in loyalty, but in the armies they might claim through her marriage or her death. Rivals from within her own bloodline offered secret treaties to the Greeks and Thracians, promising them lands if they would keep her contained. Even the priests who once polished her image into divinity began to hedge their bets, mumbling that perhaps the gods wished her to fade into ritual and memory. One by one, doors closed that she could not force open without sparking a war she had no army to fight. At last, they gave her a choice dressed up as Mercy. She could stay in Egypt as a ceremonial figurehead, appearing at festivals but stripped of all counsel and command, a living statue for the people to adore but never hear. Or she could leave for the north, to be remarried into a distant court where her name would be used to broker alliances, but her voice would carry no weight. They promised silks and gardens, temples in her honor, servants to sing her mother's songs when she wished to remember the life she had never truly owned. But Arsinoe knew better than to think exile in gold was freedom. It was only a slower burial. She agreed to leave, but on her own terms. She demanded an escort of her choosing, claiming she wished to pay respects at shrines along the way, to seek blessings from gods older than Ptolemy's line. Her brothers, eager to see her gone without blood on their hands, agreed. They mistook her calm for surrender, not understanding that surrender and survival often look the same until the moment the blade turns. Her final journey was quiet. She rode along the Nile she had once blessed with prayers her father forced her to speak. She looked at the same waters that carried grain and gold to the cities now ruled by those who had never earned them. Each village that gathered to see her pass gave her the same half-believing gaze. Some bowed as if she still carried the old divine spark. Others turned away, afraid to catch the glance of a woman so woven with scandal that even her footsteps might curse their fields. She gave them all the same soft smile she had perfected years before, the one that promised nothing but reminded them she still breathed, still watched, still waited. No one knows where Arsinoe's bones rest today. Some say she died on that journey, taken by fever or dagger slipped between the folds of her robes by a guard loyal to the brothers who feared she might return. Others whisper she escaped into foreign lands, her name traded for new clothes, her story smuggled through ports where no statue of her mother's face glared down. There are scraps of parchment found centuries later, fragmented letters hinting at a woman who once called herself both daughter and queen, who spoke of a life stolen by prophecy and hunger for power disguised as divine right. But history prefers neat endings. The priests who survived her made certain the stories that lingered showed a pious queen who sacrificed her happiness for Egypt's peace, whose tragic love for her father kept the river fed and the harvest strong. Yet beneath every carved hymn, in every crumbling scroll, the truth flickers like a lamp hidden behind temple doors. Arsinoe was not only the ghost of a mother or the vessel of a father's madness. She was something far more dangerous to the men who wrote her legacy. She was a woman who learned to wield her own myth, who bent horror into armor, who turned rumor into a blade. Even as her name was washed clean of scandal and stone, the memory of her power hummed through the empire like a warning, a reminder that no cage holds forever, no crown grants loyalty without cost, and no legend stays buried if the woman beneath it refuses to die quietly.